Good afternoon. So I'm Steve Burrell. I'm the CEO of Burrell & Company, and I'm chairman of the Life Sciences Foundation, and I want to welcome all of you to this event. It was 60 years and 2 months ago that Watson and Crick got at the structure of DNA. And it was about 40 years ago that Herb Boyer and Stan Cohen did their seminal work. And if you think about that, Watson is 83 today. Francis Crick is gone. Leaders like George Rathman are gone. And I realized a number of years ago that the leadership of this industry was beginning to disappear. And if we didn't get our history captured and written down and assimilated, we would lose it relatively quickly. And it's amazing how quickly we lose our history. A number of years ago at the Laguna meeting that we have all the CEOs together, we had a recommendation that Ron Cape, the CEO of CETUS, be recognized as one of the leaders of the industry, and half of the CEOs at that time had never heard of CETUS. And I realized that here was a founding company, and how quickly half of the CEOs of the industry didn't even know about what made this industry get started. So in that regard, we have, to some extent, two mafias. We have an East Coast mafia represented by many of you and the tremendous academic institutions here, and a bit of a West Coast mafia. And while those groups of academicians and companies work very collaboratively, the stories are interesting. And so we decided that we needed to create a life sciences foundation, which we did do. And we've endeavored now to pull the history together in a whole series of ways, from a website where we have tremendous amounts of information about the growth of this industry to an enormous compendium of oral histories. And as you begin to get the oral histories, you realize how different all of our views are about our past. And some of the stories that we all remember intimately are quite different when you talk to the various people that were part of that. So it's been very interesting for us to try and pull together, quote, the real history of what really happened. I think all of you know, as historians, history is written by the winners. It's obviously written with a perspective of what happened. So part of what we're trying to do here today, and I'll turn it over to Heather in a minute, is to provide a vehicle in which we just talk about some of these things. We gather this information up. Some of you may know something about the Life Sciences Foundation that I chair. There's some information on the back of your brochures about it. There's a publication that we have been producing on a quarterly basis that looks like this, that we hope all of you will enjoy and read. Make sure that we have your business card or other vehicles together. We only distribute several thousand of these today. We probably should distribute 50,000 of them. But as a young foundation, we're trying to make sure that we at least are talking to the right audiences and get the right storyline down. Our mission as a foundation is to capture, to record, and then to promote and develop the history of this industry. And to be, to some extent, in the education business. That is to say, to educate the world around us, to educate the future leaders of this industry and so forth. And some of you may have lots of advice and counsel, and we would welcome that on the role that this foundation can play as we move forward into the next era of the growth of this industry. Interesting to me, as someone that was there day one when we started the industry, we crossed the last year the $1 trillion mark of capital that we've raised in this industry, just in the United States alone. So on the backs of all of you and the fabulous science that we've done, we've raised $1 trillion in the United States, supporting our hopes and dreams that we could change the course of healthcare, that we could change the course of medicine, in some cases the course of agriculture and energy and so forth. So it's an absolute incredible testament that for an industry that is only about 40 years old, we've been able to amass the kind of capital to provide the fuel to build the companies. And as you know, massive amount of science funding and some major events. So today's dialogue is going to capture some of those early days through the stories of the pioneers that made it happen. So I'll turn it over now to Heather, our CEO of the foundation, to begin to introduce what we're going to do today, and then we're going to have a reception immediately following this where we'll schmooze a little bit and tell the real stories of what actually happened.
Thank you, Steve. So again, my name is Heather Erickson. I'm the President and CEO of the Life Sciences Foundation. Thrilled to have you all here with us today. I'd also like to thank my panelists. We've got a great, very distinguished group of folks, and our sponsors for making this possible, free to all of you. Biomed Realty and Ernst & Young, and then our marketing partner, MassBio, who also led us to sell out before our West Coast office even opened on Monday morning, which was phenomenal. So thank you very much for that. I also, is Senator Spilka here? No. Well, she's indicated that she was interested, so we may see her around later today. I know she's been a strong supporter of the biotech community, and I really appreciate that ongoing interest in what we do. Much has definitely changed since the 1970s and 80s, or so I hear. I'd also like to point out that a lot of those elements that laid the foundations for companies in what seems like a very long time ago are still the elements that define commercial success today. In your program, you'll find a brief timeline of the development of biotech in Boston. I encourage you to take a look at that. Those are only a few highlights from what was a very hard list to cull down. But just to give you a sense of how did we get to where we are as really one of the leading biotech clusters in the world. The region has made tremendous progress in a short time, thanks largely to the academic institutions that are here, amazing culture of innovation that it continues to thrive, the Massachusetts Biotechnology Council, and legislative support that is probably unsurpassed here in the Commonwealth with any other state in the country. We have a great panel. Their full bios or brief bios for very long distinguished careers are in your programs, but to briefly introduce, we've got Josh Boger, Bob Coughlin, Mark Levin, Phil Sharp, Henry Tamir, and our great moderator today, Eric Lander, who are going to be joining us here in a minute. These individuals have been thinking about, talking about, even managing to find time in their very busy schedules to meet about planning this conversation. So I want to thank them for their time and contributions, and invite you guys to the podium and share your thoughts with us today. Thank you.
Let me add my welcome and thanks to all of you for coming out. It's great to just have a conversation about the early days of biotechnology here in Boston. But then I think we also want to talk about the present and the future as well. But I want to start with the past. I was not there, but I know a little bit about the creation myths, and I'm very curious to find out more about the real stories behind the creation myths that we have with some of these great companies that, the legendary companies over the past several decades. I know many of you, I look around and some of you were there, but many of you weren't. And so I want to turn first to our panelists and talk about what it was like founding a biotech company when there was no model for the business. It's easy to start a biotech company today. Well, not really, actually. But at least there are many models you can point to and say, we're going to do that, or we're certainly not going to do that. But starting biotech companies when there were no biotech companies, what in the world were you imagining? I'm curious, Phil, for example, with Biogen, when you guys were sitting around imagining a biotech company, what was the model of what you were trying to create, and how wrong was it? And what were the near-death what were the near-death experiences you had, and what made it come out all okay?
Well, it would take hours to answer that question in total. It was a bunch of, in our case, in Biogen's case, it was a bunch of academics brought together by Ray Schaefer, Dan Adams, who is here, and Kevin Landry. We all got in a room and we talked about what could be done, and this was in '78. And we decided we didn't trust the venture capital group. We didn't know anything about business. We took a second meeting some months later, where we met in Paris. It's a nice place to meet in Paris. We met in Geneva, in the best hotel in Geneva, the first meeting. One thing I learned about biotech, you don't live on the same expense accounts in biotech as you do in the academic world.
Is that right?
Yeah. So, but we met in France and organized a company with a number of scientists, Wally Gilbert being their principal here, and Charles Weissman and Ken Murray. And the scientists tried to run Biogen, and that was the early store of Biogen. And we made so many mistakes that it took a businessman to come in and actually put us in order with Jim Vinson to make us move ahead. It wasn't that the technology didn't work. Alpha interferon was a product in '86, and hepatitis B was valuable for vaccine, and that was all done early on, but licensed elsewhere. And so we really made a lot of mistakes, intellectual property mistakes, investing in the wrong technology mistakes, being in several places, not being in one place, just a whole host. But good business brought us through.
So how many of those mistakes, Phil, were mistakes that are obvious in retrospect, but in prospect, even the best business person wouldn't have known better then? And how many of them were just because it was a bunch of woolly-headed academics?
I mean, we had some role models. Genentech was already organized, and Swanson led Genentech with a very focused business model that actually brought the company to products earlier and revenues earlier, strong central organization management. Biogen was a little bit less focused. But when you start early, you could make a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
When you start late, you better be damn good. Biogen was the first to get a recombinant DNA license as a private company in Cambridge. And it's still in the location that it basically started in 79 or so, because we were first located in Geneva, Switzerland, and we had 2 sites, Geneva and Cambridge.
And just last question, what was your absolutely closest near-death experience?
Closest near-death experience is when Wally was replaced as CEO. We were selling at $4 a share because we had gone out at 23, and we had more money in the bank than the company was valued.
Oh, trading
That
below
is
cash.
below cash. That's a near-death experience.
That's a statement about the negative technology value created by the management team. That's great. Now, Henry, you might have a different experience here with Genzyme. When Genzyme was founded, what were you guys thinking? What was the model, and how does that experience differ from the Biogen experience?
Yeah, it couldn't be more different.
I thought so.
We were not in a nice place in Geneva or Cambridge. We were in the combat zone in Boston. I would park the car in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, and would get proposition 3 times before I got to the office. And the way we defined where to go in these very early days was we had a meeting. We had an association with 8 professors, 7 from MIT, 1 from Harvard, all of whom you know. None of them are necessarily shy about having had the connection, but great people. And we met together in late '83, starting in November, almost every Saturday and Sunday, including between Christmas and New Year, either at MIT or in the combat zone, where Professor Chora would bring some Chinese food, and we would write down on a board. I would be the writer, and everybody else would talk, usually simultaneously, and we would try to figure out what we could do that Biogen, Genex, Genentech, CETUS weren't already doing. Integrated genetics was already around at the time, and we were trying to figure out, could we do something original? And it turned out what we could do original is to track a very, very rare disease situation. Gaucher disease, the story is well known. It was very unusual. And for the next 10 years, numerous times I would be confronted with meetings where I was asked the question, what are you thinking? Nobody knows how to spell it. And it's a very, very, very rare disease. And we were fortunate.
So how long did it take you to hit on the rare disease strategy?
During that 10 years, and it really built the culture of the company, because we overcame pretty much any thing that you could confront you. We had a plasma-derived product, first generation, and then later we had a recombinant product. The plasma-derived product we were developing in the middle of the HIV crisis. So you can imagine how enthusiastic people were, having seen all the problems with factor VIII, factor IX, the blood products, of using a source. We needed 22,000 placentas to treat one patient for 1 year. That's many.
22,000
22,000.
placentas,
We would,
one of which might have been HIV infected.
yeah,
Yeah.
the statistics were pretty decent,
Yeah.
right? And so that made people believe this was really a tease. Even if it had worked, it was not really going to help many patients. And in the end, using this therapy that did get approved, it's a very long story, 4-hour story probably to go through that, but it did get approved, and we treated about 1,100 patients before we changed within 3 years to a recombinant product that then gave us supply. But what it did, it made us believers that you could change the world, that you could be engaged in something that made a real difference. We looked these patients in the eye. I met almost every one of these early patients personally. I met their parents, their siblings, and we changed their lives in a very penetrating way. And we got cooperation from everybody around the world. People saying, egging us on and saying, this is a great thing. And where we thought we were alone or lonesome, and it was difficult to imagine that we could get this done. So many people that normally you would think of to be very skeptical, very on the side, including the agency, came part of this story and part of this great victory in a sense.
And how long did it take to convince Wall Street that this was a sane strategy?
Now, that's a very good question, too. We went public in 1986 on the basis that we could change glycoproteins. We could change the glycosylation and make them better. Gabe did not believe in this, but we thought we would make TPA go on forever. And so I went to Swanson, we can make your TPA better, longer-acting TPA we called it. And it came out of technologies that Bob Carpenter, who's here, the founder of Integrated Genetics and Genzyme, had come together. We were going to develop glycoprotein carbohydrate remodeling technology. And in fact, Bob and I went together in 1989. The Wall Street wasn't interested in that technology. They were interested in the business. We had a business that actually did not lose a lot of money. We were very, very, very careful spenders. And we stayed as long as we could in the combat zone. Wall Street was interested in the fact that we didn't lose money and we were working on something that actually could work.
As opposed to perhaps others in the industry.
Right, as opposed to. So when we went through this story, the closer we got to the point where we got approval, we got real good recognition. Wall Street came on board, and almost like what you see today. Today the markets are very similar. The markets are appreciating clinical programs that show and signal that they may make a big difference for a terrible disease.
Now, I'm guessing that Josh Boger probably was not thinking about grinding up placentas.
No.
So, what were you thinking?
Well, I didn't know that I was starting a biotech company until Kidder Peabody told me I was.
Is that right? Tell us about that.
2 years after we were founded. So I was at Merck and was coming up to my first decade at Merck, and saw an opportunity to more integrate what was emerging technologies at the time, only being slowly integrated into pharma, which were molecular biology, really active biophysics that was part of our research program, computation, but even molecular biology was just appended on to the discovery process. And so I started at Merck in about 1985, and about 6 or 7 years into my Merck career, trying to integrate these technologies more into the discovery process. And then I got the phone call from a venture capitalist that said you could do this faster outside of Merck, which was a huge surprise to me. I asked a few questions and left in 1989 to form what I thought was a pharmaceutical company. So that's actually how the venture capitalists didn't have. I don't think we were in their check mark for biotech. We were in their check for structure-based drug design, and their model was a couple of companies like Agron had formed a year before, and so they might have told in their minds it was biotech, but I never thought about the company as a biotech company. And then we had the opportunity to go public 18 months after we opened our lab. And I was told by Kidder Peabody that we were a biotech company. I said, no, we're a pharmaceutical company. He said, no, you don't have a PE ratio. So you have to be a biotech company.
Right, exactly. Right, I see. And I don't imagine you made any mistakes along the way.
Oh no. That's a 10-hour story.
Give us a couple of the really great boneheaded mistakes that you made that, in retrospect, the Josh Boger of today knows that you shouldn't have made.
I think every time that I even flinched in the direction that Wall Street wanted me to go, it was a mistake.
Really? So tell us about this.
Yeah. No, it's just the inclination to focus, not because focus is not a good thing, but because someone told you to focus was we usually resisted that, but every once in a while, a couple of times, especially in crisis moments, we sometimes listen to that. And in retrospect, every one of those was a mistake. Because this is not a business where, absent extinction events, that you should manage on a quarterly basis, but you're getting quarterly advice. So it's just a fundamental mismatch. So not to take short-term advice, which is usually coming from Wall Street. We managed to get, by going public very early, we managed to get the VCs off the board pretty quickly, so that wasn't a problem for me.
So VCs. So Mark.
I've heard a couple negative comments about
I was curious, and the VCs have gotten a bit of a bad rap here. But,
I don't know what's going on down there.
I couldn't imagine it. Tell us about your experiences. I mean, you started, and I think your path is winding or even windinger than many of the people up here. Tell us about that.
Well, my background is I actually was started almost 40 years ago now at Eli Lilly in the early 1970s. So I was at Lilly for a few years, and then I was in the brewing industry, the computer industry, and then I ended up actually in the early 80s, 1981, at this small biotech company in San Francisco, or South San Francisco, called Genentech. And I'll never forget, I was at 3 Fortune 500 companies, and my dad grew up in the Depression, and I called home, and I said, Dad, I'm moving to San Francisco. Oh, no. And I'm joining a biotech company. And he said, what the hell is a biotech company? And I said, I have no idea. And so these guys probably knew more about it than I did. I had no idea.
So why were you doing this?
Well, it was just this incredible. I had met a bunch of people at Genentech, and my old boss from Lilly in the early 70s, Bill Young, had gone to Genentech. And it was this idea, Bill told me, that I was a chemical engineer, that I could come out and head the process engineering group, and we were going to take E. coli, that was the first time I think I'd ever heard the word, and we were going to take Chinese hamster ovary cells from roller bottles, and we were actually going to design purification, fermentation processes on a large scale, and we were going to make interferon that was actually going to cure all cancer. And so I went for that. And so we made gamma interferon and TNF and alpha interferon and beta interferon.
Did you cure all cancer?
No, we didn't, but a lot of mice. A whole lot of mice. A lot of mice. And so that's how I ended up in biotech. And Genentech was an extraordinary experience. To Phil's point, Genentech, Bob was a very focused guy, and we had our core businesses, but also I was involved. We were started up an instrumentation company with Hewlett-Packard. We started up an enzyme company called Genencor. We started up a diagnostic company with Abbott. We started up an ag business with Ciba-Geigy. And so it has a lot of those early days. Gabe is shaking his head. Everybody knows this. People in the early days of biotech and today, tried a lot of different things. And we tried all these things, and we used a lot of that money actually to focus on the core business. Actually, I learned a lot there.
So were those businesses good sources of capital then
They
focused
were
on the core
good sources
business?
of capital. Genentcor's around today. Most of them actually never worked out. I remember we worked on bovine interferon for probably 3 years, and I was the engineer on that. And I remember in one meeting, I did some calculations about how much it would cost and things, and the guys on the team said we had to make it for $1 a dose. And so bovine interferon in those days probably cost $1 million a gram or something. And it took us 3 years to figure that out. So most of those projects actually didn't work out. We were making silk, we were making all kinds of enzymes at low cost, right, Gabe? You were doing all the same
This is
thing.
what Phil describes as
Yeah,
really
all
focused
kinds of
company.
craziness.
Yes.
Yeah, that was
right.
all going on.
I only imagine what's going on at Biotech
Yeah.
if that's the focused company, but all right.
All the same stuff. Everybody was doing a lot of the same
We
things.
were in energy.
Absolutely, we were in energy, we were in everything.
Indigo.
Yep, indigo, actually, indigo
Oh,
was
right,
big.
indigo, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, evolution and and natural selection is a powerful force for creativity and sorting things through. This is good. You sort of diversify and then selection happens. That's very good. So then from Genentech, you left Genentech, and tell us from there.
Yeah, so I ended up I left Genentech in the late 80s and ended up in this horrible industry called venture capital. With a group out in California, and we built a group of about 8 or 9 people to start companies up from scratch. And we started companies up in gene therapy and cellular transplantation and transcription biology. And to Josh and Phil's points, and to your point, you made the point is in those days we started those companies up, and within a couple of years, not even preclinical data, they were public companies.
Yeah.
And today, we'll come back to this hopefully, the 70s and 80s and the 90s were great times for biotech, but they really weren't real in many ways. And so a lot of those companies that we started up, they did very well. They built great technology. Some of them developed products, but they were really supported by a very buoyant IPO market and a lot of other great things at the time.
Yeah.
But one of my most exciting experiences was that in 1989, I was walking through Rockefeller. We used to walk through a lot of academic labs, and I met a guy named Jeff Friedman, and he was doing these xenobiotic experiments with mice, and he was trying to isolate this factor, which he eventually called leptin. And so I sat down with him. He had this huge fountain pens. Eric remembers these.
Yes.
And he's telling me how he's going to identify this factor using RIFLEPs and LOD scores and things like that. I had no idea what he was talking about. So I went home and I called a friend of mine, Raju Kuchalapati, who was a geneticist, and I said, what's this guy talking about? And Raju explained a little bit about the blackboard for me, but he says, you got to meet this character. He's a very difficult guy to get along with, but he's a leader in the field. His name's Eric Lander. And I said, oh, boy, I don't know. Difficult people are tough, But so anyway, I got a chance to meet Eric and went in with his story about kind of how we wanted to found this company called Millennium, and I think it was maybe 15 visits later.
Well, it wasn't called Millennium yet.
No, it wasn't called Millennium yet. Actually, that was Eric's name. And it was over 3 years, we talked to everybody in the genetics field, in the United States, in Europe, and Japan, all the leaders in the space. And we had umpteen meetings and tried to bring a lot of outstanding people together to really build a company, a vision of a company, where we could identify the cause and pathway of human disease. And so through those efforts over 3 years, we founded Millennium. And we founded it out here in Boston, which was the best place to do it.
Bob, you didn't found an early biotech company, but you have a view of the whole industry. How's things changed, in your opinion? But actually, what I first want to ask you about your own path. I know a little bit about your own path. Why do you care about this industry?
Well, I just want to state for the record, when all this was going on, I was in high school. But then I went to college. And I too majored in engineering, and when I graduated, I called my dad up and I said, Dad, I'm going to go start at an environmental company. And he said, what the hell is that?
Yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah, there you go.
it turned out I worked in the environmental space, and my clients were the academic institutions, the hospitals, and Genzyme, Genetics Institute, Integrated Genetics, and
So you were rolling drums out of Genzyme.
on Nealon Street. And I got proposition 4 times. But yeah, so my first experience with Mass Biotech Council, and Mass Biotech Council was founded in 1985. It was the first biotech trade association in the world. And it was founded by those companies to do two things, to establish a large purchasing consortium. And that was my first experience in managing. I looked at it as a sales guy and said I could service all the biotech companies like one customer and win all that volume, and what we'd do in return is just give a discount for the bulk. And the Mass Biotech Council was doing that for lab supplies, office supplies, bulk gas, compressed gas, and it was a great way to extend capital by getting great pricing, and that's still happening today. And they also, the second reason back in the mid to late 80s was because a lot of the local ordinances and bylaws were just not really aligned with what the industry needed, and people weren't educated as to what the industry was all about and what our partners in government needed to do and how they needed to align with us so that we could succeed. And again, that's still happening today. The industry has grown a tremendous amount. For me, I got involved in politics and government after my time at Clean Harbors and Environmental Services, but what really brought me to the industry was getting involved with the Disease Foundation. I have an 11-year-old son that has cystic fibrosis, and I got involved with Cystic Fibrosis Therapeutics, Inc., which was the venture philanthropy arm of the CF Foundation, and we raised a lot of money to go out and buy our own cure. So why this seemed like a fit for me was to take a organization that represented industry but had to interact with government and could help solve some of those business solutions for all these small companies. It just seemed like a really good fit. In the last 6.5 years, 6.5 years ago, we did our 2015 plan, was to identify areas that we needed to focus on so that we could continue to grow. And I'm happy to say that we're on target. And the job growth, the company creation, the relationship with the venture capital firms to the tech transfer offices is stronger than ever. So what I've seen is industry really coming together and working together to solve those common problems so that we can approach government and academia and make sure that we continue to succeed, because the future is bright, but there's a lot of threats out there still. Different threats, but significant threats.
Well, okay, so 2015 you're looking at. So let's jump from the late 1970s, early 1980s to today and looking forward. The environment for starting a biotech company couldn't be more different. I think the tolerance for working on indigo and ag and this and that and all that is there's less appetite probably. This is the case for anything that matures and the ecological niche begins to fill up. But nonetheless, there's tremendous space for real creativity. What's the experience? All of you are involved still in the industry, looking at exciting new ventures. What's the secret to starting a great biotech company now, as opposed to back then? Josh, let me start with you.
Well, a lot has changed. I'm the executive chairman of a company that has an open IND. We've manufactured drug. We have orphan drug status. We have clinical sites ready. We have FDA verbal agreement through into phase 2 plan, and we're 2 people. So
you and somebody else?
Yeah.
So
That's it.
somebody else do the work? Or?
Somebody else does 150% of the work. Right. Yeah. So that wouldn't have been possible before. And the reason we can do that is that between us, we kind of know what needs to be done. And literally on every activity, there's somebody out there who can and is willing to do it for not that much more of a margin than even on a marginal basis it would cost to do it yourself. Now, eventually you get 4, 5, 6, 7 projects, and it's better to have the internal resource. But as you start out, when you're N equals 1 project, it's not only cheaper, but it's possible to do it virtually and at very high quality. And when I started it at Merck in the late 1970s, the pharma industry was just starting to outsource some critical path activities. Every pharma company did every toxicological experiment inside the company, and they were just beginning to experiment with using an outside service to do toxicology. There's not a major pharma company now that does majority of its toxicology inside. So they've shifted, but the shift for a startup company now can be even more dramatic. And I'm not saying that and it means that your workforce is probably not any much different than it would be back in the old days, except you don't pay their salaries, and so you can load manage much easier and keep things. And I think that's the biggest change that I've seen. I think that ultimately makes startups cheaper. If they follow the old model, I think that's a mistake. If they
So there's
follow
some
the old
analogy here to what's going on with IT. I mean,
Right.
I'm told that the cost of starting an IT company is about 100-fold lower than it was a decade or so ago.
Yeah.
And we probably haven't got 100-fold because
No.
not everything's dropped like
Right.
that, et cetera. But still, the idea that it can be started in your dorm room, which is roughly what you're doing with 2 people there. I mean, you probably have a house. But
we don't live
anyway.
together.
Yeah, well, anyway. I don't want to inquire into that. But in any case, the equivalent of your dorm room, your kitchen, or something, really is a pretty interesting change there. So, but of course, it doesn't get that factor of 100 you see. But Phil, what do you think is special and different about starting a great biotech company today?
So I started Alnylam with a group of people in 2002. It was based on really new science, RNA science, and we were early movers, and it was early days in the science. And we've gotten strong support from corporate relationships and the street and banking. And so we're 10 years in, and we're in clinical trials, and we got 150 employees. And the big difference, so that is the same sort of model you saw 20 years ago. The big difference is the quality of people you can access in these companies. You can access people who've been in the industry 20, 30 years, have connections, have a stature and real presence in terms of making presentations. And employees who come into the lab trained. I can guarantee you in 1978, everybody we hired was basically a PhD out of a raw lab. The biggest risk right now is everybody should be very upset about sequestration.
Yeah.
Because if you want to see the future of this industry and other industries disappear, just stop investing in basic R&D. It'll happen.
Right. It's
It'll
not an
take you-
accident it's in Boston, right?
That's right. It's not an accident it's in Boston. The universities, I mean, you look at the timeline in this sheet, the timeline starts in 67 with Harvard creating a department of biochemistry and molecular biology. The actual commitment of the universities was in the 50s because they recruited Watson to Harvard in the 50s and Salvador Luria, who trained Watson, to MIT. So the 2 universities made a bet on genes in the 50s that then in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, created an environment for what happened here in biotech. So if those investments at those universities hadn't happened, you would be in a different place than you are now.
What's it like today, starting a great biotech company? What secret sauce has there to be of the sort that you had when you started Genzyme?
Now, in some sense, it is a little bit similar, but it is much more usable and possible today to access it. I have always had the view it is about the patients. And when you see what the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, as a patient organization, is able to do, it absolutely dwarfs, and I don't mean the basic research, but on the development side, what NIH can do, as Joshua can talk about. And you see similar things in ALS, in Parkinson's, organizations trying to get organized, patient organizations of having a specific interest. And with Facebook and with IT, with a way to reach across, the same people that supported the taxation needed to double the NIH budget, I think also will support the investments needed to make this industry thrive. In a sense, they will probably gladly support it in a much more directed way where their interest is supported. I think that's extremely helpful. It's not just pie in the sky, let's hope and pray. No, this is happening. And I experienced it myself. I started 2 new companies since leaving the Genzyme picture. Both of them have a very strong patient connection. In one case, it has already worked, the connection with the patient foundation. The other case, it's clearly there. When we think about how to finance this effort, it's a very early stage effort. It is not the venture capitalist, that's number one. It's potentially some big pharma interest, but it is also the patient organization. That's number one. And the patient organization is number one because of some very, very well-known supporters of that organization who really have an interest for very, very understandable reasons for this kind of an effort to become successful. This is very powerful, and I think it's very hopeful. This is a whole new way of funding our industry.
So it's interesting. We've heard 3 different things already about changes. We've heard about the ability to virtualize. We've heard about the incredible power of an experienced workforce. We've heard, well, something that goes back to the early days, caring a lot about patients and them being central, but the changes that have happened. I want to turn to Mark, who is, of course, perhaps more than anybody up here thinking about the starting of companies. The business of Third Rock is the starting of companies. And I'm curious, about many things, but particularly the changes in the pharmaceutical industry and what implications they have for what the possibilities are in biotech today.
We founded Third Rock 6 years ago, and it was based on the premise that the pharmaceutical industry is moving downstream pretty dramatically. And actually, over the last 6 years, they've cut back even more on discovery, as we know, inside at least. The venture community over the last decade, in general, has moved downstream very dramatically. And over the last few years, a lot of our colleagues, have actually left the space, maybe favoring Silicon Valley type things, or have left the biotech space. And I think a big reason, I don't know how many people have read the Kaufman report, Steve probably has, but if you look at the data out there, there's a lot of kind of always interesting critiques about the venture industry. The venture industry in general, and in biotech maybe more specifically, has done horrific over the last decade. And so lots of venture capitalists are going out of business. They've moved downstream. Pharma's moved downstream. We have sequestration, cutting back on research at the NIH. But the science is incredible. The institutions in this town, in San Francisco, and across the world is exploding. And so from our perspective, from Third Rock's perspective, we're overwhelmed with extraordinary people from academia now coming to us continuously with great ideas, and we can't even begin to talk to the people because very few people are talking to them now about funding broad early stage ideas. Pick your favorite new broad area today, cancer immunotherapy or brown fat, or CRISPRs, we all are familiar with a lot of extraordinary ideas out there. There's very little money on the venture side. The Series A rounds are dropping down dramatically. So my biggest concern right now, Eric, is not today, but if we look out 10 or 15 years from now, how many great new startups are we missing that are going to work with pharma and develop products? The data over the last decade or so is that products that pharma actually brings to the market, between 50 and 70% of those, depending on what year, have come out of biotech. And of course academia and biotech together, not just biotech. So if that drops off dramatically over some significant period, I actually think the pipeline will take a big hit 10 years from now. And I think it will take a big hit.
You and Phil are talking about 2 very related points. The failure to be investing in basic research in the academy, and the failure to be investing in broad, early stage ideas in venture mean that this developmental life cycle that goes from some academic idea to some early stage investment and then goes to all these things Wall Street rewards today, we're just not doing the beginning of it. And there's some magical thinking that, well, the rest of it's going to keep going even though it's a successful pipeline. And we'll all somehow just be doing late stage things with having had no early stage things to give rise to the late stage things. Well, that's an interesting challenge. Boy, I'm hoping somebody will have a solution to it. But no, seriously, that is the challenge for us right now, because you do have to come up with models
to financially reward each stage of this if you're going to get a working ecosystem. And at the NIH level, you've got to have an understanding that there are public goods and that that stuff has to be invested in by the public because it isn't a reasonable thing for venture investment. At the venture investment level, we're going to have to figure out how do you actually mobilize capital for those risky things. And I think Third Rock and a few others are trying to create these models with partners with pharma and elsewhere to figure out how to mobilize capital effectively. But there's also a role for the state in this. And so I want to turn to you and ask, what more should the state be doing? How do we, in all different imaginable ways, create this ecosystem, strengthen this ecosystem, so that 20 years from now, when these people are still back, and it'll be the same people on the panel, because while you may be worrying that they're disappearing, I don't see any evidence of it up here. Tell me, what should the state be doing?
I think it ties in perfectly with what Phil and Henry were talking about as it relates to sequestration on a federal level and also where the patient population fits in. We've been so fortunate here in Massachusetts. I was down in DC just yesterday meeting with colleagues of mine from different parts of the country, and we're really the envy of the world because of the relationship that we have with the current administration and with leadership on the House and the Senate. We've come such a long way. Josh sits on the board or you were sitting on the board of the Life Science Center. You still are when it started. That goes back 6 years ago. We, as industry, we stepped up to work with our partners in the legislature to form a biotech caucus. Now, legislatures all over the country are establishing a biotech caucus. Take those members of the House and members of the Senate that are interested in innovation and science and what's good for patients and educate them on our issues. We have here with us the chair of the Biotech Caucus on the Senate side, Senator Karen Spilker. I think we should really clap for her because Senator Spilker, who I had the pleasure of serving with her when we were in the House together. She's actually assumed a leadership role with the president of the Senate, and she's still remained on as the co-chair of the Biotech Caucus because she loves it so much. She's our advocate in there. When we formed the caucus, we came up in working with the administration to establish the 10-year $1 billion life science initiative. That's not even about the money. It's about government raising their hand and saying, we want to learn, we get it, we want you here, we don't want you to be the IT industry that left the information highway to go to the
the raising the hand is much more credible if there's money attached to it.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely, and it helps.
We should continue to think about that money being
and that money
just earnest money behind this nice sentiment.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and that money should be used in spaces where, the capital markets aren't taking care of it. Government's job isn't to compete with the Third Rocks, it's to actually help with the Valley as well.
I look at what's going on in New York right now, and New York, I think, is making a very serious commitment to being a major center in biomedicine.
I think
I
New York.
watch the philanthropic community in New York is stepping up in an extraordinary way. The mayor has stepped up in an extraordinary way. You were watching New York institutions raiding Boston in all sorts of ways. What do you guys think about this?
I'd say, look, let's compare the amount of NIH funding that we win every year compared to that in New York. Let's look at the job creation. Let's look at the construction. Let's look at
that's a way of looking in the rearview mirror. In the rearview mirror, we look great. But going forward, if you ask about the level of investment at all levels, government, philanthropy, et cetera,
VC.
I don't think we have VC. I'm not sure that we should, sit on our laurels and be self-satisfied in any way.
Absolutely not.
I mean,
We should never do that.
Yeah, well, okay. I think it's something. A number of places are taking this really seriously, and I'm just struck by how many moves are getting made in New York right now. It turns out, I'm told, they have a lot of money in New York.
What I think, I was out in New York at their annual, the New York Bioannual meeting last week. I think what their challenge is connecting New York City with leadership in Albany, and I wish them the best because if I don't care where a disease is cured as long as it's cured, and there's the same amount of sick people in every state, and that's where the disease foundations come back into it. But where we are unique, that state, local, government, and our federal delegation is all on the same page, and that's what's helping us succeed moving forward.
And if the Congress could just, anyway.
It helps us. It helps us compete, and this competition from New York and San Francisco, from wherever, is great. It makes us better.
keeps our game up, which is good for patients, which in the long run is the only excuse for
only
this
excuse,
industry.
yeah.
Otherwise, this is a very complicated industry to bother being in, except for the fact that it saves lives. Well, I'd like to take a few minutes. There are a lot of easier things to do.
Almost everything.
Almost everything is easier to do. And if you didn't go home feeling you were going to save lives, you wouldn't do it. But I think there is no better feeling than to go home feeling like that's what you devote your life to. I'd like to throw it open to a few questions from the floor. We might have about 10 minutes or so for questions from the floor.
Hi, Harriet Weiner. And I wonder what your thoughts are about partnering with institutions around the world on specific technologies and on businesses in terms of startups and what your thoughts are. And are there some countries that you feel would be more appropriate for this kind of activity? Thank you.
It makes no difference, other than that it doesn't have the power of the cluster. But it can get access. It needs to work to get access. And it's not that they can substitute for it. No, they need to come. But you can. This is an very open society here, open world. You can do these things everywhere. Cooperation globally is clearly very much been a hallmark of this industry. I think everybody here has a lot of experiences that allow you to say, yes, I learned a great deal and I'm very grateful for having had those relationships in Asia or those relationships in Europe. Whether they are leverageable in a financial sense, that's very specific.
With both the pharma industry and the biotech industry more and more going towards orphan drugs, and they're carrying very high prices, fully legitimate, of $200.
It's kind of you to say.
$200,000 to $400,000 a year. How is that going? How are people going to? How is society going to continue to pay for this as you leverage expensive drugs upon expensive drugs, not only in the US but in the rest of the world, but including the US? And how is that going to impact the future success of the biotech industry?
The criteria is that in these orphan drugs, these drugs need to work. And not every drug for an orphan disease has the kind of value that you're describing. They need to work. To get the things that work is an enormous investment. The approach that you need to take is a very global approach in terms of pricing. You can't do it here at a massive discount and here something else. We always had one price globally or for free, and if patients couldn't afford it or a country couldn't afford it, we had a for free policy, and that worked. It worked for us. Can it be extrapolated over a long time? Now there are incredibly large investments in the healthcare field that make only very minor contributions or maybe no contribution. So the reallocation of resources, financial resources in the healthcare field will create tremendous space for things that work. The cost of healthcare is associated with stuff that doesn't work. We today cannot treat Alzheimer's disease appropriately. $265 billion is spent on giving people very little health that have that disease. The opportunity to get to stuff that works will allow us to start to reprioritize where money is spent in terms of hand-holding and other very difficult healthcare costs that really make very little contribution. And that's the challenge. We have to show as an industry that we make that kind of difference. If we don't, we will actually have a very tough challenge. And it is a great challenge to have. We need to not be shy about it. We need not to make crazy extrapolations, say we solve every rare disease overnight. We don't. Maybe a few a year. And they are very marginal increases to the overall healthcare expenditure, and we need to be extremely transparent on explaining what it is that we did and what the value is.
So Andrew, you're basically saying if there's real value to patients, then it can justify real prices.
Absolutely.
If there isn't, it shouldn't. Yet we have a Congress that is absolutely opposed to comparative effectiveness research, to actually measuring value for cost. What do you think about that?
As companies, we should do that work ourselves. Right? We should show the value. It's for us to show the value and to explain it, in as good a way as it is explained. It's not always perfect.
But you know, if you do the research about your value, that's one thing. But would you support the federal government funding comparative effectiveness research?
Depending on how you set it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the key there is that what is it intended to do? You know, the easiest comparative effectiveness trials are to try to have a shootout between two drugs that may be a factor of 2 in price, and sort of so we can decide which one quote is the best. But that's what comparative research devolves into. If the purpose of it is price. So my answer to the worry about high-priced drugs is stop focusing on price and start focusing on value. If we try to focus on price, we'll get higher prices and lower values.
Right.
So if we focus on value and keep asking that question, I mean, ask the question of why an uncomplicated delivery cost a factor of 3-fold different at 2 hospitals in Boston, instead of why it's a transformative drug and a disease has to have a price that justifies the next one. And society, as opposed to Congress,
Yes.
people. One of the things that's absolutely reliable across this country is if you put out a card table with a help my child get treatment X, and outside of a Walmart, people who are shopping for the last penny will take out $20 bills and put it in the box. So the American people are actually very optimistic and very willing to put transformative treatment at the highest priority, and somehow this is not translating because we're having the wrong argument. We're having the wrong argument about saving money in healthcare. Why should we be saving money in healthcare? What else are we going to spend the money on? How many iTunes downloads can you do in a day? Okay, it's the disquiet for healthcare is that people feel like they're not getting value from it, and that's a conversation that we should be having.
Yeah, Eric, I just wanted to add to that, and to your point, I agree with what everybody's saying on the panel. I think the point is, though, that developing $100,000 treatments in the oncology field that extend our lives 2 or 3 months, I think, to the point here that's made, is not really fundable in the future. And I do think we need leadership in Washington.
Yep.
So, you know, we can have the foundations help us, we can have the biotech companies help us, but without it, you know, if we were to redesign the system from scratch with an overall strategic view, we would sit back in Washington and come up with some very wonderfully descriptive algorithms about value, life extension, reduction of different, pathologies or whatever, and that's how we would price drug. I think one of the things we have to remember, and you've led the world in this, 5 and 10 and 15 years from now, rare genetic disorders will not just be Gaucher's. We're looking at cardiology and breaking that into dozens of rare genetic disorders. We're looking at obesity and looking at dozens of rare genetic disorders. What happens now when those are all rare genetic disorders? So the value equation has to be thought of strategically in Washington. You know, NICE in the UK and others are thinking about these things. I think we really need to step up and think about it.
Well, look, I agree, although the idea that we say Washington should really do that may be magical thinking.
You
don't have a parliamentary. You have
you.
a parliamentary democracy in England. It can act.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether, and I don't want to get into a long discussion of it, but I think for us in Boston and thinking about across the industry, whether the industry here ought to be thinking about setting some examples and models, because whenever Washington does get to the point where it can move, it would be good if really sensible models that got to real value were out there, as opposed to, I agree, what are the wrong kinds of studies. So I think it's a responsibility on us to provide those models to Washington, and because there will come a moment when they do want to move, and we've got to have pilots and things that are shown that it can work.
The hardest thing for for the industry as a group or even individuals to do is actually criticize our peers.
Yeah.
So
That's why I'm
it's-
pressing it. 'cause-
No, exactly. So but it is, as long as we defend, patent-protected purple pills that aren't any more effective than the non-patented
Right.
versions that were there before, then as long as we defend that and think that any broach
not
on that,
credible.
we're not credible, and there's a lot of that out there.
Right.
And by the way, we're all arguing about 12% of the healthcare budget, and there's another 88% that we shouldn't deflect criticism from by pointing to that. But there is a Willie Sutton principle here. If you want to save money, you should go where the money is, and it's not in drugs.
Well, but we'll be more
deliberate.
credible saying that if we're able to look at our own house
Exactly,
as well.
but we need to be more credible.
All right, now we've used up our allotted time, but I want to thank the Life Sciences Foundation for organizing this conversation. I certainly learned a lot, and what an amazing panel who'd be willing to come together and talk about. I guess we've covered everything from the earliest days, either in the combat zone or Geneva, depending on one's preferences for where to hang out, to what to do about the future. So I just want to thank this amazing panel for sharing all this.
Turn it to Steve. 60 years ago, this industry at some level was birthed with the structure of DNA in Watson and Crick. It was about 20 years later, in the late 60s, early 70s, that the actual industry was birthed around that science. And it was about 20 years later, by the early 90s, that we began to see the profitability emerge from some of the early developments. Today, it's interesting to note that we have some 10,000 plus biotech companies in the world today. And in fact, there are more companies outside of the US today than there are inside. And so while this represents an incredible brain trust of what happened here, if you spend time in places like China and India and other places in the world, you realize that the concentration of companies that we're going to compete with globally have changed dramatically. I think the other thing to remember is that we're spending, as this last discussion was, we're spending $3 trillion on healthcare in the United States today. That $3 trillion is going to $5 trillion by 2017, so in just 2 or 3 years, we will more than double a healthcare cost in this country. And the twin drivers of that are two things. One, a rapidly aging population. Remember that we consume 60% of our healthcare costs in the last year of life. It's an astounding statistic. And the other driver is chronic care, and that is that we can keep us all alive forever. So we've gotten rid of most of the things that used to kill us. In year 1900, just 100 years ago, the average age of death in the world was 31 years. Today, 100 years later, the average age of death in the world is 78. And we made that massive change, more than doubling life expectancy because of the work that these guys and others did at curing cancer and cardiovascular disease and metabolic diseases and so forth. And so the cost of chronic care today, 76% of our cost in the United States is keeping everybody alive. And while it's unpleasant to talk about, a dead patient is a cheap patient. And so it does cost us an enormous amount keeping all of us alive. And so this driver then of this discussion that we just had is very, very real. Just as a piece of language for a minute, we talked about our healthcare system, but we don't actually have a healthcare system. We have a totally dysfunctional sickness care system. And the question is, and the question we ended up answering here is, can we move that dysfunctional sickness care system into an increasingly effective and efficient healthcare system where we have some reason to and some incentive to maintain our state of wellness. And then at the back end of it, when sickness does occur, that we can actually do things that actually work. 55% of the drugs used in this country don't work for the patients that they are for. And this value equation that we ended up talking about, I think it's helpful to recognize that the healthcare system has been driven around procedures and cost. And the healthcare system of today and tomorrow is driven around outcomes and values. And the big change that we have as an industry today is the question is no longer can we get this stuff to work and can we get it approved, but can we get it paid for and utilized in a system that's going to be based on outcomes. And so I too want to thank the panel for the discussion. We intended to leave at least an hour or half the time we're together for more informal discussions. So we have a reception right outside so we can commence that informal discussion. But I want to remind you that the work of this foundation is a work in which we hope to capture the stories formally and informally. We would like as many of you as we can to help tell these stories before we lose them. You have to have a vehicle to preserve them. Fortunately, social media and the internet provides us technology that we can use to preserve them and then to share them. And we thank you for your support and thank you for being with us today.